Well, let's open our Bibles in Revelation chapter 13. I think you'll probably agree that this is one of the most difficult chapters of the book. And there's a number of difficult chapters in the book of Revelation, and this is probably one of the most difficult. So I've been working hard this week at trying to understand it and prepare the message for you this morning. So I'm going to ask you to work hard this morning. I want you to sit up, wake up, listen up. I remember my old maths teacher. He was a really good teacher. And he had a bit of a novel way of getting us to learn the lessons. Before we went in, this is in high school, but before we went into the lesson, he would come and open the door, but he wouldn't let us in. And the first thing he would do is make us run. He'd send us for a jog, the whole class, around the football field, at least once or twice. And then when we were puffed out, we'd started to sweat a little bit, he'd let us in, and then we would start the lesson. And he would always say that he did that because he believed that in order to think straight and to be attentive to the lesson, he said we needed to get the blood pumping, we need to have oxygen into our brains, and so he would make us do the run. Well, I'm tempted to ask you to do the same, because you're going to need it this morning. I won't, but it might be a good idea sometimes to go for a jog in the morning, perhaps just to wake us all up or something, I don't know. Anyway, if I can put it this way, if your tendency is to just sit back and relax and maybe even nod off on a Sunday morning, I'm watching. Well, we need to try and understand this passage. And I think, having looked at the passage this week, I think there are three things that I want to say to you this morning, three things to draw your attention to. They are, first of all, just to say a word about the context. Now, I won't say very much about that, just a few words about the context, but that's the first point. I think it's important. So we're looking at the context, and then secondly, we're going to look at the characters. We need to identify who John is talking about here in this chapter, who are these two beasts that he sees. So we'll look at the characters, and then thirdly, we'll just try and draw some conclusions, some practical lessons from the chapter for us to take away with us. So that's where we're going, the context, the characters, and the conclusions. So just look with me at the context. Like I say, I'm not going to say very much about this. The first point will be very brief, but I think it's important for us to understand and to think about the context if we're really going to understand what John is saying. Let me say something really profound. Chapter 13 comes after chapter 12. There you go. You didn't expect something that profound this morning, did you? Well, it's obvious, isn't it? But it's very important. We need to see this chapter in the context of the vision. You remember this vision, it starts in chapter 12. We've been looking at that over the last couple of weeks, and last week, you'll remember, we were thinking about the chapter 12. Well, of course, we need to remember, don't we, that in the Bible, when these books were originally written, and when the recipients of these books first read them, there were no chapters and there were no verses. Chapters and numbers and verses have been inserted hundreds of years later for our convenience, so that we can refer to a specific part of the Bible and everybody knows where we're going, and then we can look at it in that way. But in those days, they didn't have chapters and verses. And so when you read through from chapter 12 into chapter 13, the context becomes clear, I think. Look at it. In verse 17, at the end of the chapter, you remember, he says there, Then the dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the offspring of her war on the rest of her offspring, on those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. And he stood on the sand of the sea. And I saw a beast rising out of the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 diadems on its horns and blasphemous names on its heads. And the beast that I saw was like a leopard, its feet were like a bear's, its mouth like a lion's mouth. And to it the dragon gave his power and his throne and great authority. You'll remember that the focus of our attention last week was on the dragon. And we saw there in chapter 12 that what we have really is the dragon faced and then forced out and then finally furious. He's thrown down. There's no room for him in heaven anymore. He can't accuse the saints anymore before God, which is what he loves to do night and day, we're told. And yet he's not allowed anymore. The victory of the Lord Jesus Christ over him on the cross, that victory has thrown him out. There's no space anymore. There's no right, as it were, for him to come and accuse the brethren before God, before his throne anymore. And he is furious because of that. He is frustrated. And so what does he do? He goes off to make war on the rest of her offspring. In other words, on the Christians, on the New Testament church. Now, chapter 13 explains to us how he does that. He does it by using 2 beasts. They're introduced to us in verse 1 and 2, and then again, the second beast is introduced to us in verse 11. But you see what John is saying, just as we begin this morning looking at the context. Whoever or whatever these beasts are, Satan is behind them. This is how he makes war on the rest of her offspring. Actually, there's a third, and we'll come to that later on. Babylon the Great. But we'll see what that means later. John, for now, is just focusing on these 2 beasts. And what he's telling us right from the start is that Satan is behind it all. He gives his power and authority and a throne. He lends his authority to these beasts, whoever or whatever they are. They are his allies. They are his henchmen. And so, quite simply, that's the context. Point number 1 is over. We're moving on quite quickly, aren't we? Point number 2, the characters. We need to identify who these beasts are, don't we? If you read the commentators or you click on the internet, you'll hear or read all kinds of interpretations as to who these beasts are. It almost seems, when you read this passage, it almost seems a bit of a puzzle, doesn't it? And when you hear these different interpretations, and there's some really far-fetched and some really out there kind of interpretations, I don't know, sometimes, you can read this passage and hear these things and you think to yourself, well, you just shrug it, who knows? I mean, who is it then? This one says that, and this one says that, and this interpretation, and blah, 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 and so on. And it's almost, you sort of end up just scratching your head and you're thinking, well, who knows? How can little old me, how can we, understand these tremendous things that have been written so, 2,000 years ago, and what is it all about? We can almost give up in despair before we've even started. Well, what's the answer? Yet again, we need to remember, don't we, that the book of Revelation is based on the Old Testament. It is full of Old Testament prophecies being revived, if you like. And John borrows these Old Testament prophecies to help us to understand the things that he wants to communicate. That's why I read earlier from Daniel chapter 7. I'm not going to read that again, But I don't know if you notice the similarities between the passages. The sea begins to be stirred up. And the sea, the oceans, the waters, in the Old Testament very often represents the peoples, the nations. They're always being stirred up, as it were. There's never any peace for the wicked. And the picture is given to us of the sea that's always moving. And that's what the nations are like, aren't they? That's what the world is like. It's like this never resting sea. And then out of this sea of humanity comes these beasts that Daniel describes there. And I don't know if you noticed, but they're the same animals that are mentioned here. One's like a lion, one's like a bear, another one's like a leopard, and so on. And it's all similar here. Well, what was that prophecy in Daniel talking about? There's no doubt about what it was talking about. It can't be. He was talking about the kingdoms of this world that were going to come. He was talking about Babylon and the Medes and the Persians, and then the Greek Empire, and then finally the Roman Empire. And all of these animals, they were pictures, if you like, of those kingdoms that were about to come and conquer the world. And that's how we understand. I'm not going to spend time now going into Daniel, but that's, if you look at it, that's really what he's saying. And now he's writing to these Christians in Rome. These Christians in Asia Minor. These Christians who were living at the end of the first century under a terribly despotic ruler in Rome. Nero, by this time, had died. The Caesar at this particular time was Domitian, and he had a nickname. He was known, it was a bit of an urban legend, but Domitian was believed to be, by many, the resuscitated, revived Nero. They called him Nero Revived, because he was just as cruel and callous as Nero himself had been. Now, we find it hard to imagine what it must have been like, don't we? In our day and generation, in this world in which we live, it's so difficult for us to enter in, to try and imagine what it must have been like for the Christians living at the end of the first century. But let me tell you just a few things to try and put a little bit of a picture on it. Nero, many of them would have lived under Nero. Nero, he came to power when he was just 17 years old. His stepfather, Claudius, the Caesar, he'd been adopted by him really and taken into the family, but his stepfather, he died in AD 59. Guess how? Poisoned by Domitian's mother. He only had one natural son. This is Nero. He was called Claudius only had one natural son. His name was Britannicus. But when Claudius died or was assassinated, Britannicus was only 14 years old, and it was illegal in the Roman Empire for a 14-year-old to take the throne. So Nero took over. He's only a few years older, but Nero took over just until his stepbrother was old enough to take control and become the Caesar. His mother was behind it all. She's the one that killed Claudius. And on the day before Britannicus was due to come of age and become the Caesar, guess what? She killed him. Again, believed to be poisoned by Nero's mother. And that left Nero and his ruthless mother, controlling mother, in complete control of the empire. In the early times of Nero's reign, the coins that were printed had both himself and his mother's faces on them, because she wanted to know that she was really in charge. She was the one that was pulling the strings. Nero was only 17. He's a bit wet behind the ears, really. And so his mother was controlling the empire and helping him rule. But before long, he became sick of it. And guess what? He killed her, or had her assassinated at least. At just the age of 21, he kills his own mother. He did the same with his wives later on. Later on in his reign, he only reigned for 13 years, but what a notorious rule it was. For 13 years he reigned, and towards the end of that time, he orchestrated a fire in Rome and blamed it on the Christians. Great persecution broke out in Nero's time against the Christians. One of the Roman, I'm sorry for all this history lesson, but we'll get through it. Just stick with me if you can for a moment. One of the contemporaries of John and of this time was a man by the name of Tacitus. He was a Roman historian. He saw these things, he was a witness to these things, and he said this about the death of the Christians, the persecution against them. He wasn't sympathetic towards them or anything, but this is what he said. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. They were covered with the skins of beasts and then torn apart by the dogs. Or they were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burned alive, serving as nightly illumination when daylight had expired. They were the street lamps. Christians covered in tar, alive, and burned as used as street lamps and as lamps for his gardens to illuminate the night. But in AD 68, Nero committed suicide at the age of just 30, after 13 years of reign. And it nearly ended the Roman Empire. The following year, there were 4 claimants to the throne. It caused civil war, and it looked as though Rome was about to be finished. It was tearing itself apart until Domitian took over, and he reunited the nation. Nero revived, as he became known. Many Christians at that time thought that he, Domitian, must be the Antichrist. Such was their suffering. And you can see why they would believe that. The terrible things that he did to them. They believed he was the Antichrist. He was even worse than Nero. Now, with all of that in mind, just read again the first few verses of chapter 13. Listen to it. Verse 1. And I saw a beast rising out of the sea, with 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 diadems on its horns, and blasphemous names on its heads. And the beast that I saw was like a leopard. Its feet were like a bear's. Its mouth was like the lion's mouth. And to it the dragon gave his power and his throne and great authority. One of its heads seemed to have a mortal wound, but its mortal wound was healed. And the whole earth marveled as they followed the beast, and they worshipped the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast. And they worshipped the beast, saying, who is like the beast, and who can fight against it? This mortal wound. Why does John mention this mortal wound? Well, surely it's a reference to Nero. This kingdom was completely under threat when he committed suicide. It seemed as though the whole of Rome had a mortal wound, but it recovered, you see. And you can just imagine the rejoicing of the Christians when Nero committed suicide and the persecution subsided for a while. They had a year of peace while Rome ripped itself apart. And surely they were thinking, this is wonderful, isn't it? Oh, but now Domitian, he's coming. And it's like Nero back to life again, and it's all starting again. You see what's happening here? When you read these verses with knowing a little bit of the history there, I think it's quite obvious what John is talking about and who this beast is. He's writing in code, of course, and symbolism, because these were dangerous times. But the Christians there, in that generation, would have known exactly what he was talking about, right from the beginning. It wouldn't have been a puzzle to them. This is Rome. And you see the horror of it all. Daniel talks about 4 beasts representing 4 kingdoms that would come one after the other. Oh, but John, you see, he sees one beast, and then it's like all 4 of them poured into one. It's a horrific sight, isn't it? So the first understanding, the first interpretation surely must be that this was Rome, but we shouldn't believe that it was just Rome, because this is really successive empires, isn't it? This is, if you like, if we can put it this way, this is surely political power being used by the dragon against his people. And how many times through the history of this world have Christians suffered under the political powers of their lands, persecuted simply for naming the name of Christ? Personally, I don't think that the first beast is difficult at all. Well, what about the second? Well, that's even easier. Look at verse 11. He says, "Then I saw another beast rising out of the earth. It had 2 horns like a lamb, and it spoke like a dragon." Who's this? Well, what we have here is not political power, but the power that so often goes alongside political power, religious power, being used again by the dragon. Now, why do I say that? Well, there's a couple of verses later on in the book of Revelation. It makes it really, really crystal clear. Chapter 16 and verse 13, we read this: "And I saw coming out of the mouth of the dragon, and out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet, 3 unclean spirits like frogs." Who's that second beast there? Well, it's the false prophet, clearly. Or if you go over to chapter 19 and verse 20, look at it again. Chapter 19 and verse 20, it says, "And the beast was captured, and with it the false prophet, who in its presence had done the signs by which he deceived those who had received the mark of the beast and those who worshipped the image." John himself gives us a crystal clear interpretation of who this second beast is. It's the false prophet. And again, we're not just to think of one, but all false religion. All false religion. Julius Caesar, in his time, attempted to unify the empire. The problem that they had in Rome, of course, was that they had been so successful all over the world. There were so many nations and cultures with their religions and their gods that now made up the Roman Empire. So how could he unify the empire? Well, it was simple, wasn't it? Give them one God. Who? Himself. And so on the coins, he was called Pontiff Maxim. He demanded, and so did the other Caesars afterwards, they demanded worship on behalf of their subjects. They had these blasphemous names on their heads, you see. And all of this put together, you see, I mean, Caesar even started his own priesthood. There was a high priest in Asia Minor where John is. And he would have experienced this and seen something of the effects of all of this. So what you have here, when you put it all together, is political power and religious power working hand in hand in order to make war upon the saints. And of course, there's no room for the Christians now, is there? When you've got Caesar on the throne and he's got his own priesthood and so on. And behind it all is the devil himself. It's the dragon that gives them power. That's the point, isn't it, here? So you can see what John is saying. In another New Testament passage, it's saying exactly the same thing, and Paul is saying the same thing in Ephesians chapter 6, isn't he? We do not struggle against flesh and blood. It's not really against the powers that be. We don't struggle against flesh and blood. We struggle against the rulers and authorities and the cosmic powers over the present darkness and against the spiritual forces of evil in heavenly places. That's the real battle, Christian. You see what he's saying? He's lifting the veil for a moment, isn't he? He's helping us to see what's really all behind it. It's the dragon, isn't it? And John is saying the same thing here. We live in the days of the internet. We all know what www means, don't we? World Wide Web. Well, John is saying, behind this world, behind the earthly forces, there is a world wide web of iniquity and evil. Don't misunderstand me. I am not saying that the internet is wicked. I'm not saying that political powers, all of them, are of the devil. We're not saying that. We're not to push it that far. But when the devil uses these powers to make war on the saints, we're to see him behind it, not just the powers themselves. And we need to have eyes to see that, don't we? Shakespeare seemed to understand it, didn't he? You remember the story of Macbeth? Macbeth is the story, really, of an evil general and his wife. She's even worse than he is. And he's determined to become king. But it all begins, before any of the wickedness that unfolds in that story, it all begins with the scene of three witches on the moor, concocting their potions and their plans. You see who's behind it all. That's how he starts. This is what it's all about. Now, that's what John is communicating to us here through these two beasts, these pictures. So what are the conclusions? What are the lessons that we need to learn as we take this away with us this morning? Well, there are three things briefly. Firstly, let me just point out to you the subtlety of the dragon. The subtlety of the dragon. Compare with me, if you will, verse 1 and then verse 11. Look at it. And I saw a beast rising out of the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 diadems on his head, on his horns, and blasphemous names on his heads. Who does that remind you of? Well, it's the dragon himself, isn't it? That's almost word for word from chapter 12, where this dragon is introduced to us back there. And then look at verse 11. Then I saw another beast rising out of the earth. It had 2 horns like a lamb, and it spoke like a dragon. Well, what a contrast. One is a monster, similar to the dragon himself. The other, well, he's like a lamb, like a little pet lamb. Nobody's going to be afraid of a lamb. A little lamb, oh, how sweet, how innocent, how docile the lamb. This lamb, it wouldn't do you any harm. But he speaks like a dragon. You see? Isn't this what the Lord, our Lord himself said in the Sermon on the Mount? You remember? In the Sermon on the Mount, he says, beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. It's the same picture, isn't it? These false prophets, they come to you in sheep's clothing. Beware, says Jesus. Watch out. Be on your guard against the false prophets. Why? Well, because they don't look scary at all, do they? They look as sweet as a little lamb. Yeah, but they're talking like the dragon. And you see the warning then. We need to be careful, don't we? And I just want to remind you, believers, I want to remind you of that this morning. I honestly fear that there are many Christians today who are just oblivious to these things and are not aware at all, or not watching, they're not on their guard. They'll listen to anything that calls itself evangelical. John is saying, look, they might speak smooth words like a lamb, but their breath stinks like hell. That's what he's saying. Watch out. Beware, Jesus says. These are dangerous people. They look so sweet. And false religion, it does, doesn't it? It's deadly. It's a monster. It's one of the beasts. And who's behind it all? Satan himself. So watch out, believer. Watch out. You know, I sometimes think that, we can be far too English. You know what I mean? We tend to shy away from straight talk, don't we? We'll beat around the bushes as English people. We'll beat around the bushes and say nice things. We need to learn how to call a spade a spade. And false religion is not an innocent lamb. It's a beast of the devil himself. And it will take you to hell if you listen. It will, So we need to notice the subtlety of the devil, but then secondly, we need to understand this mark of the beast, don't we? I'm sure some of you have been thinking, as we've been looking at this passage, right towards the end there, he talks about the mark of the beast and then the number. Well, what's all this about? Well, look at verses 16 and 17. He says, it also causes all, both small and great, both rich and poor, both free and slave. This is the beast he's talking about. It causes all to be marked on the right hand or on the forehead, so that no one can buy or sell unless he has the mark. That is, the name of the beast or the number of its name. Let's just stick with that mark first of all here for a moment. What is this mark? Are we to go around looking for some kind of tattoo on people's foreheads or the back of their hand? Is that what it is? You wouldn't believe it, but that's what some Christians believe. They actually take these things literally. It's quite incredible. Others say, "Oh, that's a microchip," and it's in the vaccine. This microchip is in the vaccine, you see. So don't get the vaccine. How on earth they're supposed to put a single microchip in every single batch of, well, not just one, is it? Anyway, let's not go there. But it's ridiculous. And Christians, sadly, are capable of coming up with all kinds of conspiracy theories, aren't they? We're brilliant at it. What is this mark? Well, surely it's the same as the seal that we found in chapter 7 regarding the saints. You remember they're sealed with the seal of the living God, he says. And that seal, as we were thinking back then in chapter 7, really is an expression of ownership. God puts his mark of ownership. What's that? The Spirit of God living within us. That's his mark of ownership. Slaves, of course, in those days were branded, weren't they? But it's not just slaves now, is it? That's why he goes on to say here, everyone, rich and poor, small and great, slave and free, everyone who follows the beast, they've got this mark on them. On their forehead or on their right hand. Why? Well, surely the forehead points to their thoughts, the thought life, the way they think. And the right hand points to the way they live, their actions and so on. So what John is saying to us simply, when you think and act like this, well, you can be sure that the devil has left his mark on you, can't you? And so I need to ask you, what do you think about? What about your thought processes? What about your philosophy of life? What about your actions? What do you do? How do you live? Just because you're in church this morning doesn't mean you can assume that you haven't got the mark of the beast on you. Can you? It's one thing to profess Christianity, but the question is, what do you think like? What's your thought world like? What's your world like? What do you do? Are you governed by the way of this world? You see, when we talk like we give ourselves away sometimes, don't we, as Christians? You'll hear Christians say, well, yeah, but everybody's doing it. the sexual revolution kind of thing, free sex and all that kind of thing. Let's just have open relationships and all. Well, everybody's doing it, they say. Well, that's the point, isn't it? Everybody's doing it. That's what John's saying. But just because everybody's doing it doesn't mean you should. And if everybody is doing it, well, you better beware then, haven't you? Because surely that's the mark of the beast. And I need to ask you, has he left his mark on you? Or do you have the seal of the living God, the Holy Spirit living within? Are you engaged in the battle against the dragon and his two beasts? Do you know something of these things? Oh, that the Lord would deliver us and make us truly his. And let me just close with a word about the number here as well. This number, verse 18 in particular, or the end of verse 17 says that is the name of the beast, or the number of his name. This calls for wisdom, he says. Let the one who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. He says this calls for wisdom. He doesn't say, now here's a riddle for you to play with for the rest of time. Sadly, that's what so many people do. The Pope's phone number. Have you heard that one? It's got 666 in it, apparently. I don't know. The Pope's phone number. Credit cards. Years ago, they used to say, oh, the back of credit cards, they've all got this secret number. They're all 666. The European Union. Napoleon. Hitler. Stalin. Marilyn Manson, believe it or not. Somebody actually wrote to me a while ago and said that 666 is Marilyn Manson. Wow. It's depressing, isn't it? How we Christians can be so gullible. It's pathetic. What is he talking about when he says 666? It's very, very simple, really. It's not literal, it's symbolism. So let me ask you, what is the big symbolic number in the book of Revelation? 7. It's full of number 7, isn't it? There's 7 churches, there's 7 bowls, there's 7 trumpets, there's 7 this, that, and the other. There's 7 visions all the way through. It's all about the number 7. Why? Because the number 7 indicates perfection, fullness, wholeness, completeness. So what's number 6? 1 short of 7. That's what it is. Always. Always. Let me just read this wonderful commentary by Hendrickson, really. And he says this on this matter. He said, let not the believer despair. Let him remember that the number of the beast is the number of man. Now, man was created on the 6th day. 6, moreover, is not 7. And it never reaches 7. It always fails to attain to perfection. That is, it never becomes 7. 6 means missing the mark or failure. 7 means perfection or victory. Rejoice, O Church of God. The victory is on your side. The number of the beast is 6. 6. 6. That is failure upon failure upon failure. This is the number of man. For the beast glories in man and must fail. Do you see what he's saying? It's very, very simple, isn't it, really, when you think about it? It's just failure upon failure upon failure. Never reaching satisfaction. That's this world, isn't it? And when the number is repeated 3 times in Scripture, that is absolutely emphatic. Remember? The angels, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. Why? Because he's so intensely holy. And they express it with a repetition of the word. And And so when John says here 666, you can be absolutely sure of it. It is utter failure, dissatisfaction. It's said that the children of Bach, the musician, the composer, he apparently wasn't a very good riser in the morning. He wasn't an early bird, put it that way. And it was a bit difficult to get him up sometimes. And his children worked out a brilliant way of getting him out of bed. What they would do is they would go to the piano and they would play a piece of his music. And they would get almost to the end and just leave the last note. And he drove him mad. And he could hear the music, and that was fine, but he had to get up and just press that last note, whatever it was. Well, that's what John is saying here, isn't it, about this number? Have you got the wisdom to see it? To see through the world and all that it is? To see through the lies of the devil and these two beasts and all that they're doing? The world is empty. It never reaches completion. It can never be satisfied. The Rolling Stones, they sang that song, didn't they? I can't get no satisfaction. That should be written large above this world, shouldn't it? You'll never get satisfaction in this world. That's the number of the beast. It's the number of man. It's never going to be 7. But you see, John is saying, you belong to the 7. So don't fall for the lies of the devil when he puts all the pressure that he possibly can on you through these beasts, the political and the religious powers. They're trying to confine you. They're trying to squeeze you into their mold. Don't believe a word of it, he's saying. He wants to wake us up. He wants to create in us a desire to see the 7, to go and press that last note. And that's what our life is supposed to be about. Looking for the 7, seeking the 7, pursuing, not just lazily, sort of just casually going through life, as it were, but seeking the 7, pressing the last note, getting to the glory, as it were, even now. Well, as I close, let me just take you right back to the start, and I will be very brief. But look at the beginning of this passage. Some versions include the last phrase of chapter 12 in chapter 13, the first verse of chapter 13. It doesn't really matter where it goes, whether it's at the end of 12 or the beginning of 13. But you see what he says. Look at that verse. Then the dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring, on those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. And he stood on the sand of the sea. Well, the question arises, who's he here? Is it John himself? Some versions do say that. And I stood on the shore, on the sand of the sea. I think he's telling us who it is in that same verse. He says he goes off to make war against the rest of her offspring, on those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. And he stood on the sand of the sea. Now that's very important, isn't it? You remember he's already told us that picture in chapter 10, verses 1 and 2. It's a similar picture. He stands on the sea and on the land. What's he saying there? Why does he include that little note? It almost seems superfluous, doesn't it? It doesn't seem to mean anything. But why does he say that? Well, I think he's talking about perspective here. You remember the old films, the old movies back in the 50s and 60s and so on, when they made these sci-fi movies. Maybe they had dinosaurs in this picture or something. And of course, they didn't have the advantages we've got today of CGI and so on. And so they had to make do with what they could. And so they would, let's say, get a little lizard. And they would put the lizard right up close to the camera so it looked enormous, and make a scenery that made it look as though it was enormous. Didn't they? That's how they would do these things, visual effects, to make something small appear enormous. But then occasionally on these pictures, you would see something in the shot that wasn't supposed to be there. maybe a person's finger or something, or maybe the microphone just sort of dangling, and it gave it all away. You knew it was rubbish anyway, but it gave it all away, didn't it? And you couldn't see them. And now all you're thinking about is this little lizard. Isn't that what John is doing here? He sees these big monsters coming up out of the sea. Oh, but Jesus has got his foot in the shot. And that gives the game away, doesn't it? They seem so mighty and powerful. Rome itself and religious power seems so devastating. Let's remember the perspective, shall we? He's got his foot in the shot, and that gives it all away. These things, they're going to come to a sticky end, aren't they? They cannot last, because he will win the day. Let's pray.